Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Hope everybody is having a great day. So today we're going to talk about our egos. And the ego gets thrown around a lot. You'll hear people say, well, that person's egotistical and that person is self-centered. And it all kind of goes back to the person's ego. But I don't think the ego is described quite as it should be in relation to how detrimental our own egos can be. But I think it's safe to say that we all have this little voice inside of our head that tells us that we aren't good enough. And the reason for that is that is really the ego, okay? That chomping at the bit, that telling you that you're this, you're that, whatever, all these irrational thoughts is really your ego. And why that exists is because, these are stories that are being told repeatedly. A lot of times they're repeatedly told to us subconscious and unconscious. We're really not aware of it. It's almost like a computer screen that's on, but there's programs running in the background that we really can't see. That's the ego telling us we're not good enough. We're always going to be alone. We're always a failure. It's like it sits on top of our shoulders and has this conversation with us that drives our behaviors. That's where fear comes into play. Ego has a lot to do with our fears, partly because its main driver is two things: to predict and protect, being one, and then number two, being right. So most of us believe these irrational thoughts. Why would we believe them? Well, number one, they're constantly told to us inside of our head, and we tend to believe them because it's repeated so much. Just again, look at anything in life. If you repeat the same thing over and over and over again, people tend to believe it. Well, that ends up being what our ego is telling us, that we're not good enough, we're going to be alone, we're always a failure, so on and so forth, right? So it feels as if it's going to protect us and keep us safe. And the reason why that is because, again, it can control the narrative. It can control our behaviors. Even though they are irrational, they are also familiar. When we've entered into scenarios that validate the feeling of not being enough, that validate the feeling that we are a failure, that validate that we're always going to be alone, or whatever of the millions of thoughts that may run across our dashboard multiple times a day, that tends to be what we believe. And that tends to be what drives our behavior, which tends to be why we enter into the same scenarios and cycles over and over and over again. It isn't just because we're broken people, because we're not broken. It isn't because we have problems. We don't have problems, okay? We have something that sits on top of our shoulder that for whatever reason has occurred in our life because of a certain time period in our life where that voice was thus inserted into us. Because maybe you didn't make the basketball team, or maybe because a girl broke up with you, or maybe because a girl cheated on you, or a man cheated on you, or whatever. Insert whatever terrible thing, or even worse, when we get into like abuse and trauma in childhood, those messages tend to be repeated to us over and over and over again, which thus drive our behavior. We know on the surface level, these behaviors are not safe. We know that these are going to end up in disaster, but we do them anyway because we feel as if they keep us safe, because we can predict and control a narrative, all driven by our ego instead of being driven by our intuition. Now, let's get into what I do. One of the things that I do is I feel like I'm going to bust the ego, because I'm going to prove that the ego is not right. It's wrong. It's driving your behaviors. It's driving emotional eating. It's driving the relationships that we choose to be in. It's driving the narrative that we feel about ourselves, all of which is rooted in bullshit. Now, that's easy for me to say on the other end of the table. I can 100% relate to this scenario. I myself have an ego, just like all 8 billion people that we live on this earth. But when I'm coaching a client, it is really important for me to not only trace back to how this happened, how we got to this point, but also to be able to name the ego, to give it a name and realize that when it's talking to us, it's not saying anything that's of value, nothing that is subjective. It's trying to predict and protect us. It's trying to keep us safe, but it's also trying to be right, which means it's trying to put us in situations that validate its existence. When we no longer pay attention to it, when we control our own narrative and we run on our intuition, it starts to dissipate. It starts to disintegrate in a way that we're now driving our behavior based on the things that we want to have happen, positivity in our life versus the negative reinforcement of this voice that keeps talking to us. If this is something of interest to you, and you feel like you have this little voice inside of your head that keeps talking to you, that keeps downplaying you, that keeps this fear-based motivation inside of you, that you know you're capable of much more, that you know that you want to accomplish bigger and better things in your life, then maybe it's time for us to have a conversation. I'd love to get to know you and what your challenges are. I don't believe you have problems, and I don't believe that there's anything wrong with you. But when you have something inside of your head that keeps chomping at the bit that tells you that you're not good enough, that you're a failure, that you're always going to be alone, you're going to have irrational behaviors in relation to those irrational thoughts. It's just life. It's just our human condition, but we can do something about it. So drop me a line, send me a message. Would love to have a coaching call with you, invite you into our coaching program, and let's bust your ego so that you can be the best version of yourself. Because without it, you're going to be a limited best version of yourself, which is not where anybody wants to be. So hope everybody has a happy and a healthy day. Buff Gandhi, I'm out. Woo!